My wife of 25 years told me, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, that she couldn't trust me anymore. Not because of one specific thing I'd done recently, but because of who I'd slowly become across those 25 years. Someone she said she barely recognized compared to the man she'd married. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to list every anniversary I hadn't missed, every bill I'd paid on time, every reason a wife should trust a husband who'd never once been unfaithful, never once raised a hand, never once done anything that fit the usual categories people mean when they talk about a marriage breaking down. I didn't argue, because somewhere in the middle of trying to build that defense in my head, I realized, with a specific, uncomfortable clarity, that she was right. I want to tell you what I actually did wrong across those 25 years, because it wasn't any single dramatic betrayal. It was something slower, and I think, more common than people usually admit to on camera. I think most of these channels talk about betrayal as something dramatic and singular, an affair, a lie discovered, a specific broken promise. What happened in my marriage was quieter than that, and I suspect, watching my own reaction that afternoon, that it's actually a far more common failure than the dramatic version, one that rarely gets named clearly enough for people to recognize it happening in their own marriage before genuine damage accumulates. I met Diane when I was 28, working as a teller at a regional bank branch, still young enough to believe my career would remain a means to an end, rather than the entire shape of my identity. I remember the man I was during our early years together, genuinely present, curious about her days, willing to leave work exactly on time to make our dinner reservations, the kind of husband who noticed small things because noticing hadn't yet become crowded out by whatever came to occupy my attention instead. We married when I was 30, and for the first several years, I think I was largely that same attentive man, building a life alongside Diane, rather than simply providing for one from an increasing distance. I remember our first apartment specifically, small and cluttered with mismatched furniture we'd collected from both our families, and a specific Sunday ritual we maintained for years, reading the entire newspaper together over coffee, trading sections, discussing articles that caught our attention. It sounds like a small thing now, describing it. At the time, it felt like the actual foundation of the marriage, an hour each week where nothing competed for either of our attention. Diane worked as an elementary school teacher throughout most of our marriage, a career she genuinely loved, and I remember, in those early years, actually visiting her classroom occasionally on my lunch breaks, sitting quietly in the back while she taught, something that felt, at the time, like ordinary marital involvement, rather than anything remarkable. Looking back now, I understand that specific habit as one of the clearest early markers of the genuine attentiveness I'd later, gradually, allow to fade. I want to describe how the shift actually happened, because I think understanding the mechanism matters more than simply acknowledging the outcome. I was promoted to assistant branch manager around our 5th anniversary, then to full branch manager 3 years after that, each promotion bringing genuine pride alongside genuinely longer hours, more evening obligations, more of my actual attention gradually redirected toward performance metrics and staff management, rather than the marriage itself. I don't think I consciously chose the career over Diane at any specific moment. I think, across roughly 2 decades, I simply let the career's demands set the terms of my attention by default, assuming, without ever explicitly deciding it, that the marriage would simply continue running well on its own momentum while I focused my active effort elsewhere.
I remember, specifically, when our Sunday newspaper ritual quietly ended, though I couldn't have named the exact date at the time it happened.
Branch audits started requiring Sunday preparation work roughly 8 years into the marriage, and what began as an occasional exception gradually became the default arrangement, until Diane simply stopped setting out 2 coffee cups on Sunday mornings, having learned, through repeated disappointment, not to expect the ritual to happen anymore. I want to describe this from Diane's side too, based on what she's since told me directly, because I think it matters for understanding the full weight of what she meant that afternoon at our kitchen table. She described years of quietly managing our household largely alone, raising our 2 children through countless evenings I spent at the branch, handling problems that, in hindsight, Other managers regularly delegated rather than personally absorbing the way I habitually did. She described birthdays where I was present physically, but distracted mentally. Anniversaries where my gifts became increasingly generic, purchased hastily rather than chosen thoughtfully. Evidence, she said, of a husband whose actual attention had migrated somewhere else, even while his body remained in the house. She told me, during that same conversation, that the specific pain wasn't any single incident, but the accumulated weight of 25 years of feeling like a well-managed obligation, rather than a genuinely known and prioritized partner. She described a specific image that stayed with me long after that conversation ended, that she'd started, at some point she couldn't precisely date either, thinking of herself as one item on my daily list of responsibilities, alongside the branch's staffing schedule and quarterly performance reviews, rather than as the actual center of the life we'd once explicitly built together. She said she'd stopped bringing up small daily details from her own life, somewhere along the way, having noticed, gradually, that my responses had become polite rather than genuinely curious. I want to describe that kitchen table conversation in more detail, because the specific words mattered as much as the general sentiment. She'd asked me, a week earlier, to genuinely be present for a difficult conversation about her own aging mother's declining health. A conversation I'd promised to prioritize, but ultimately postponed twice for branch emergencies I now understand. Looking back honestly, could have been delegated to my assistant manager without any real consequence. When we finally sat down, she told me plainly that she'd stopped trusting me to actually show up for what mattered to her, not because I was dishonest or unfaithful, but because 25 years of pattern had taught her that my attention would reliably go elsewhere whenever anything at the branch demanded it, regardless of what promises I'd made to her beforehand. She used a specific phrase that afternoon I've never forgotten. "I don't think you'd ever leave me, Wayne. I think you'd just keep quietly leaving the room while staying in the house." I sat with that particular sentence longer than almost anything else she said, understanding, even in that first raw moment, that it captured something more precisely than any accusation of outright dishonesty could have. I want to be honest about my first reaction, because I don't think the eventual realization I described in the cold open arrived instantly or gracefully. My immediate instinct was defensive, building the same list I mentioned earlier, every bill paid, every anniversary technically remembered, every conventional marker of a good husband I could recite to counter what felt, in that raw first moment, like an unfair accusation, given how faithfully I'd avoided every dramatic marital failure I understood the category to include. It was only later that evening, alone in my study replaying the conversation, that a more uncomfortable realization began surfacing, that avoiding dramatic betrayal isn't the same as actually being present, and that Diane's specific complaint about consistent attention rather than any single act of dishonesty was actually a more demanding, more legitimate standard than the lower bar I'd apparently been quietly measuring myself against for over 2 decades. I sat in that study for nearly 3 hours that evening, going through, almost compulsively, a mental inventory of every good husband credential I could recall, and finding, uncomfortably, that nearly every single one was transactional rather than relational. Bills paid, anniversaries technically marked, obligations fulfilled, but very little genuine curiosity about who Diane actually was becoming across those same years, what she thought about, worried about, hoped for, beyond the logistics of running our shared household. I spent the following several weeks in a specific kind of difficult self-examination I hadn't undertaken in years, going back through old calendars and photographs, trying to honestly assess whether Diane's account matched what the actual evidence showed, rather than my own more flattering self-perception. It matched, more consistently and more painfully than I wanted to admit. I found years of anniversary photos where my expression, looking back honestly, showed a specific distracted quality I hadn't noticed at the time. I found calendar entries where branch obligations had displaced family commitments repeatedly enough to form an unmistakable pattern, rather than isolated, forgivable exceptions. I found one specific photograph from our 18th anniversary that I stared at for a long time, a dinner Diane had clearly planned carefully. candles, and a dress I remembered her buying specifically for that evening. My own expression in that photograph showed someone present in body only, eyes slightly unfocused, clearly still processing some unresolved branch matter rather than genuinely inhabiting the evening she'd built. I don't think I noticed that distraction at the time. Looking at it years later, with Diane's kitchen table words fresh in my mind, it was unmistakable. I retired 8 months after that kitchen table conversation, earlier than I'd originally planned, understanding clearly that continuing in the same demanding role while attempting to rebuild trust with Diane would likely repeat the exact pattern that had eroded it in the first place. The retirement itself created its own financial pressure, my pension considerably smaller than a full-length career would have produced. Pressure that, combined with the marriage's genuine crisis, eventually led us to seriously research retiring somewhere our reduced income could stretch further, while we also worked, deliberately, on rebuilding what 25 years of gradual neglect had worn thin. I remember the specific conversation where I told my regional director I was retiring early, watching his genuine surprise, given how many additional years he'd apparently assumed I had left in me professionally. I didn't explain the actual reason, simply citing personal circumstances, understanding that the real explanation, that my marriage required more of my attention than the branch could continue receiving, belonged to Diane and me, rather than to my professional colleagues. I want to emphasize that this research, unlike some of the career decisions that had damaged our marriage, was something Diane and I did genuinely together, evening conversations at that same kitchen table where the crisis had first surfaced, now used deliberately for the kind of shared planning I'd let atrophy across 2 decades of prioritizing the branch instead. We chose a mid-sized coastal city, settling on the decision together after both researching independently and comparing notes. A small but meaningful shift in how we approached major decisions compared to the pattern of the preceding years, where I'd typically decided unilaterally and informed Diane afterward, rather than genuinely including her in the process. I remember Diane's specific reaction the first time I asked for her independent research findings, rather than simply presenting her with my own conclusions and asking for agreement, the way I'd handled most major decisions throughout our marriage. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and told me later that the question itself, genuinely wanting her separate perspective rather than her endorsement of mine, felt like the first real evidence that something had actually begun shifting rather than simply being promised. It was a small question, practically speaking, but it carried real weight given the specific pattern we were both trying to interrupt. The first months here were difficult, in ways that combined ordinary adjustment struggles with the specific, harder work of actually rebuilding trust, rather than simply hoping distance from the old career would automatically repair what years of neglect had worn away. I remember a specific evening about 6 weeks in, when old habits briefly resurfaced, a period of restlessness where I found myself scrolling my phone during dinner the way I once habitually had. And Diane, without anger, but with a quiet directness she hadn't shown before this whole reckoning began, simply asked whether the old pattern was already returning. That question, delivered plainly, rather than accusingly, did more to correct my behavior in that moment than any argument could have, precisely because it named the pattern clearly, rather than letting it slide unaddressed, the way 25 years of gradual drift once had. I made a specific, deliberate practice of asking Diane directly, most evenings, what had actually mattered to her that day, a practice that felt almost embarrassingly basic, given 25 years of marriage, but one I understood. Honestly, I genuinely stopped doing consistently somewhere in the middle of those branch manager years. Sing! 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 I remember how awkward that practice felt initially, both of us aware of exactly why I was suddenly asking questions I'd stopped asking naturally years earlier. The deliberate effort itself, carrying a slightly uncomfortable, self-conscious quality, neither of us fully knew how to navigate at first. Diane told me, honestly, during one of those early evenings, that she appreciated the effort but also felt a little strange being asked questions that once would have simply emerged from natural curiosity rather than conscious practice. I want to describe a specific moment, about 5 months in, that I think marked a genuine shift rather than simply continued effort without visible result. Diane mentioned, almost in passing, a minor health concern she'd been quietly managing, the exact kind of detail that, during our branch manager years, would likely have registered only partially in my distracted attention. This time, I noticed immediately, asked follow-up questions, and accompanied her to the resulting doctor's appointment without her needing to specifically request my presence, the way she'd sometimes had to during our earlier years together. She told me afterward, in the car, that she'd noticed the difference, that my immediate, unprompted attention to that small detail meant more to her than any grand gesture could have, precisely because it demonstrated the consistent, ordinary presence she'd told me she'd been missing for years, rather than a single dramatic proof of changed character. I want to be specific about what actually shifted in my own behavior, because I think vague claims of becoming more present don't capture the concrete texture of the change. Diane has told me, more than once, that specificity matters here precisely because vague good intentions were never actually the problem in our marriage. I'd always intended to be present. What was missing was the concrete, repeated practice of actually following through on that intention consistently. I stopped, deliberately, checking my phone during our evening conversations, a habit I hadn't fully recognized as corrosive until I consciously eliminated it. I started asking Diane directly, weekly, whether she felt genuinely heard that week, rather than assuming her silence indicated contentment, the way I'd apparently assumed for much of our previous marriage. I began, for the first time in over a decade, actually remembering details from her conversations without needing reminders, evidence, she's told me, that my attention had genuinely redirected rather than simply performing attentiveness temporarily. I also revived our old Sunday ritual, adapted to our new life here. No newspaper, since we'd both largely moved to reading news online, but a dedicated hour each Sunday morning, coffee on our small balcony, phones deliberately left in another room, simply talking through whatever occupied either of our minds that week. Diane mentioned, about 4 months into this revived ritual, that it had started feeling less like a deliberate practice and more like the natural instinct it had originally been decades earlier, before the branch had gradually crowded it out. I asked Diane recently, honestly, whether she believes the trust she described losing has genuinely returned, or whether some permanent wariness remains from those 25 years of gradual disappointment. She told me it's returned considerably, though not entirely to the uncomplicated trust of our earliest years together, an honesty I've come to respect, rather than resent. She said, watching me sustain this changed attentiveness across nearly 2 years now, rather than a brief initial burst of effort that eventually reverted to old patterns, has done more to rebuild genuine trust than any single conversation or apology could have accomplished on its own. She also told me something more difficult to hear, honestly, but something I think matters for anyone watching this, expecting a completely tidy resolution. She said there's still a small, quiet part of her that occasionally braces for the old pattern to resurface, some evening, where I might drift back into distraction the way I once habitually did. She's told me she doesn't think that particular wariness will ever fully disappear, and I've made peace with that, understanding it as a reasonable, earned caution, rather than a failure of my own continued effort to actually change. If your own spouse has told you something similar, that you've become someone they don't fully trust, despite no single dramatic betrayal, I want to tell you what this experience taught me. Don't build the defensive list I initially built, cataloging every conventional marker of fidelity while missing the actual, more demanding complaint being raised. The absence of dramatic betrayal isn't the same as genuine, consistent presence, and I think many marriages erode not through singular crises, but through exactly this kind of slow, unexamined redirection of attention that both partners initially fail to name clearly until the damage has genuinely accumulated. I built that same defensive list twice, once mentally at the kitchen table, and once again, more thoroughly, over the following days, and both times it protected my own ego far more than it served any honest understanding of what Diane was actually telling me. And if you recognize the pattern honestly, Understand that rebuilding requires sustained, ordinary consistency rather than a single grand gesture. The daily practice of actually noticing, actually asking, actually remembering, repeated across months rather than performed once dramatically and then allowed to lapse back into the old pattern. I'd also add, specifically, that the discomfort of that initial self-conscious effort, the awkwardness Diane and I both felt asking and answering questions that should have emerged naturally, is a genuine, necessary part of the process, rather than evidence you're doing something wrong. Rebuilding a habit that atrophied across years doesn't happen gracefully or naturally at first. It happens through deliberate, occasionally uncomfortable repetition, until the deliberate practice slowly becomes, once again, the genuine instinct it originally was. I think about that kitchen table conversation often. Still, the specific discomfort of realizing Diane's assessment was more accurate than my own defensive self-perception had allowed me to see clearly. I don't think that discomfort was a failure to be ashamed of indefinitely. I think it was the necessary starting point for actually changing something that 25 years of unexamined pattern had allowed to quietly erode. Diane and I still sit at a kitchen table most evenings, here, 4,000 miles from where that original conversation happened, and I make a point, every single evening, of actually asking what mattered to her that day, a small practice that cost me nothing, and once, apparently, cost our marriage nearly everything by its consistent absence. If your own marriage has reached a similar reckoning, I hope you find the same kind of honest self-examination I eventually managed, uncomfortable as it was to sit with initially. Being technically faithful was never actually the full measure Diane was asking me to meet. I hope you find your own version of what that fuller measure actually requires, and the sustained, ordinary consistency it takes to rebuild trust once it's been genuinely, if quietly, worn away. Diane and I renewed our vows last year, quietly, just the two of us and a small local officiant, on our 27th anniversary. I wrote my own vows this time, something I hadn't bothered doing at our original wedding decades earlier, promising specifically what I'd failed to promise then. Not fidelity in the narrow sense I'd once assumed was sufficient, but genuine, sustained attention, the fuller measure I finally understood. At 64, a marriage actually requires. Thank you for sitting with a quieter kind of story than the usual dramatic betrayal. I think it deserved telling honestly, exactly as it happened. I'll see you in the next one.